You and your co-author, Jonathan Swan, have an excerpt from your new book, Regime Change Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump, in the New York Times today. It's fascinating. You describe in it a Situation Room meeting where Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a detailed pitch for going to war with Iran. Do you think the public fully grasps just how influential Netanyahu was in President Trump's decision to attack Iran? What have you learned?
So our reporting, Anderson, for the book, and this is our first excerpt from it, the book comes out in June, but relates to how this particular lead-up period, and I think it's important to underscore, and again, we write about this today, Jonathan and I do, that the president and Bibi Netanyahu have actually been much more aligned in certain ways over a very long period of time than certainly a lot of the president's base of supporters want to see, and then some of his own advisors either recognize or want to admit. And if you look back at his first term, President Trump's term, the strike on General Soleimani was something that a lot of people opposed around him. He really didn't have any hesitation about doing it and just did it. There were some people who were thrilled that he did it. It had repercussions, right? I mean, Iran has been looking to go after him in one way or another ever since, and it has escalated tensions there. But it shouldn't really be a surprise if you look at the decade-long relationship. When Bibi Netanyahu came to this Situation Room meeting with the president and the president's senior advisors on February 11th, it's pretty extraordinary, Anderson, because it is clearly unusual for a foreign leader to be in this kind of an in-person meeting in the Situation Room. It certainly speaks to the magnitude of it. But Netanyahu was laying out a number of different ways in which they believed this could go, that a war could go, and it would involve taking out ballistic missile capacity. It would involve Iran not attacking its neighbors so aggressively. It would involve Iran not choking off, minimal likelihood of choking off the Strait of Hormuz. And then there was the possibility of regime change, that it could happen. He played a video of possible options for who could take over if there was, some change or disruption to the clerical leadership in Iran, although most of the Americans didn't really favor the people that he was talking about, or some of the people he was talking about. So he didn't suggest this all as, if this, then this is the absolute outcome. But certainly President Trump was impressed by what he heard. He didn't completely say yes right there, but he did say sounds good to me, or something to that effect, to the prime minister. And it was clear that that was a likely green light. It was clear to the president's advisors that he was impressed with what they saw. The next day, there was an overnight assessment that was done by U.S. intelligence officials, and there were aspects of what Netanyahu described that could be done, but the regime change scenarios were described by the CIA director as farcical and by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as bullshit. And so that is where it becomes a conflation of a lot of different points. Most notably was that J.D. Vance was the most adamant voice against doing this in the president's circle, and repeatedly said this in front of his colleagues to the president.
Fascinating. Maggie Haberman, thanks very much.
I want to start with some of the reporting that they have on the ambivalence that was in the room. Mr. Rubio, of course, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, indicated to colleagues that he was much more ambivalent. Ms. Wiles, Susie Wiles, Chief of Staff, had concerns about what a new conflict overseas could entail, but she did not tend to weigh in hard on military matters in large meetings. General Kane, the Joint Chiefs Chair, was not a political loyalist, and he had serious concerns about a war with Iran, but he was very cautious in the way he presented his views to the president.
What's fascinating about all that reporting is group that together with also how some of how the IC community, how Ratliff and also Rubio pushed back on the briefing that these top officials got from the Israelis as well. You did have officials saying, in this story, Marco Rubio basically dismissing, this report. Others saying that the Israelis have a tendency to exaggerate in this briefing. Go ahead.
Let me just put sort of a little meat on that bone real quick. So what you're talking about also in this report is Prime Minister Netanyahu went into the White House on February 11th and gave some very bold, optimistic assessments of what could happen if the U.S. and Israel went to war there.
Into the Situation Room, by
Into
the
the
way, not just
Situation
White
Room,
House,
thank
but
you,
yes,
right.
yeah.
So you have the Israeli Prime Minister in the Situation Room with this small group of people, including the fact that it could bring an end to the Islamic regime. And what you were saying, this according to the reporting, when Mr. Trump joined the meeting of the U.S. intelligence officials after that Netanyahu briefing, Mr. Ratcliffe briefed him on the assessment. The CIA director used one word to describe the Israeli prime minister's regime change scenarios: farcical. At that point, Mr. Rubio cut in other words, it's bullshit.
I think that is really important to highlight, right? Especially if we're going to talk about the ambivalence that people had to express a dissenting view, to the president, because you did have doubts there. But those doubts weren't forcefully argued to the president, right? And we've talked often, going back to last year, about how loyalty is such a measure of success in this administration. And I've often had a reporting target of how does that translate in these meetings where you would expect a back and forth and a counter argument to be presented, and then another argument to be presented? Or is it that some of the most powerful, influential people in government are really just focused on, at times, telling the president what he does rather than what he does not want to hear, right? And this reporting was so important because on something as pivotal as whether or not to go to war, it really seemed like the only person who presented that counter argument was the vice president, was J.D. Vance.
And Shelby, let me read you part of that reporting. In front of his colleagues, Mr. Vance warned Mr. Trump that a war against Iran could cause regional chaos and untold numbers of casualties. It could also break apart Mr. Trump's political coalition and would be seen as a betrayal by many voters who had bought into the promise of new wars.
Yeah, the vice president seems to have been the most forceful one in the room and sort of laying out more clearly what everybody else was trying to quietly express to the president. And so, I do think that there was clearly some effort to say, hey, hold on, what about this? What about this? But I think that at the end of the day, there's a few aspects. A, the people around Trump this time around are very careful. So even when they express their opinions, I think sometimes it's curbed, and they aren't as forceful as, say, the vice president. But I also think that the president had already made up his mind. And I think that there was an acknowledgement among the room and among this group of advisors in particular that, okay, well, we'll say there are some risks to this, but at the end of the day, as that reporting notes, the team around Donald Trump, at the end of the day, whenever he does something, they'll voice their opinion, they'll say something, but if he wants to do it, they go ahead with it. Yeah. And this is a clear example, even something as huge as going to war with Iran.
Yeah, which, that is actually in keeping with the way most administrations are. He's the president, he was elected, they weren't, and so forth. I do think the fact that the U.S. intelligence agencies push back on the notion of any idea of regime change from this maybe speaks to why the U.S. goal at the beginning and still now wasn't, they were saying regime change would be nice, but it's not part of our goal.
But I also, so there's the intel side of the briefing that Israel presented, and as you're saying, that many in the U.S. were skeptical of from the U.S. intel community. But I think it also exposes, this reporting, the political divide that exists, because so much criticism on the right and the left, and I don't mean just what J.D. Vance said about you promised no new wars, but it's about Israel leading the U.S. into this. That is the core of the critique on the right and the left of Trump's foreign policy in this moment in time. And I think that this, having Netanyahu in the Situation Room, the tightness around this, to me, exposes the heart of that concern.
And real quick, one of the right wing's most ardent opponents of the state of Israel is Tucker Carlson. And in this reporting, it says that Tucker went to speak to the president about this. Mr. Trump, who had known Mr. Carlson for years, tried to reassure him, they talked on the phone. I know you're worried about it, but it's going to be okay, the president said. Mr. Carlson asked how he knew, because it always is. And I think that's another dynamic here that we can't push aside, which is that the president feels so emboldened, or at least felt so emboldened by, in this first term, getting out Soleimani, by the operation in Venezuela, both of which were so different from what he embarked on with Iran, but that was a part of his thinking as he went into this operation 6 weeks ago.